Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome, listeners, to Talk with Sue. This is a For the Record series that we're producing and was created basically to allow a voice for people who are opposed with the Muskrat Falls deal or opposed to the process of sanction being used. It's important, people feel, I guess, to have the voice of those in opposition. They're not typically your big business, and they're not government, and they just don't have the cash and deep pockets that these other two organizations have. Of course, the government is spending our money to do it. Nevertheless, we need to have a people's voice as well, and that's what this series is all about. Tonight's guest is a familiar voice, a familiar public voice, many of you will know, a gentleman who has jumped face and eyes into Newfoundland Labrador politics. Brad Cabana is joining us tonight, and for those who don't already know, Brad is a graduate of political science, a retired infantry captain in our armed forces, and served as a mayor of a community in Canada and is involved in business. So I'd like to take this time now to welcome Brad to the program, and let's get set up. Can you hear me, Brad?
I can hear you fine, thanks, Sue.
So, where do we start with this? First of all, as I like to ask all guests to the program regarding the Muskrat Falls issue, when did it start for you from the standpoint of being concerned about the deal, and when did you decide this is just not right?
Well, it essentially it came about even before the decision was announced. To be honest, I was involved in just speaking with local people in my community. At that time, it was Glovertown, and the issue of the Upper Churchill was on a lot of people's minds, and it was a driving force. A lot of people were unhappy about that. And this particular gentleman I talked to daily about it actually worked on the Upper Churchill, and he said he hoped to live long enough to see the deal undone. So, it sort of started there, piqued my interest. I got involved with the PC Party. I was a member for 25 years before that in the PC Party. And so I got involved with the PC Party in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I started sort of pushing that agenda. And then I started getting some pushback for pushing that agenda. And then I suppose it would be the night before Mr. Williams announced at the convention in October of 2010 the Lower Churchill or Muskrat Falls Agreement. I was pulled aside by a minister and said, there's going to be this deal, and it's going to solve these issues. So you don't need to worry about the Upper Churchill. And so I listened. I was quite excited about it, of course, and I listened to the presentation. And at first, I thought, well, if this is what works, this is what works. We didn't have any details at that point in time. And then the first thing that struck me immediately was when I heard that the subsea line could not carry any more than 500 megawatts of power. And I knew immediately that wasn't a solution to the problem, that I personally saw in regards to Newfoundland making money, and Labrador, I should say, making money and profiting and helping the people out and sort of redressing the Upper Churchill. I knew that wasn't going to do it. And so I immediately started thinking, well, why are we doing that? It's ridiculous. And then, of course, the cut to Emera, which would take another 200 megawatts off the line. So basically 300 megawatts of power to sell to whomever in the eastern seaboard of the United States. It just didn't make any financial sense. If you study the international power markets, you realize that 300 megawatts is not even, it's like putting a drop in the ocean. It's that insignificant. So then I started to get, my curiosity became very, very piqued. I started doing a lot of research, and it sort of went from there.
I guess, Brad, would you say, okay, so we went through, you essentially thought something else was coming down, and when you first heard the announcement, and I guess the Emera involvement as well as the ability, the transmission ability, that concerned you. Did you have any thoughts as to why or how this is going, where it came from? For many of us, there was an energy plan process where people participated and said, here's where we want to go, and there was a lot of talk about an energy warehouse and the province becoming an energy warehouse, and wind was discussed, and and hydro was discussed, and other technologies could be wave, could be tidal, geothermal, all sorts of things. Did you find that this really came out of left field? I mean, is this what you were expecting at all?
I wasn't, of course, like I said earlier, I was, pushing for some sort of redress of the Upper Churchill because that's where the profit is, insofar as hydroelectricity. It's the cost of generation, and what we're receiving for that is like 0.02 cents a kilowatt hour. So that is where the profitability is, and so that's what I was aiming for because, of course, I was sort of hoping to have a program that reduced or eliminated the debt in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so that's what I was pushing for because there was money to be made on that aspect. So I wasn't expecting to see the Lower Churchill, or I should say at that point in time, the Muskrat Falls Agreement put forward. And it was new to me, although it had been researched in the past. However, when I saw it, in conjunction with a few other things I'd seen at that convention, also on, it was essentially, I think, if memory serves me right, I believe it was the same evening at that convention where Mr. Williams announced that Gary Norris, I believe his name is, his chief executive of the, as clerk of the executive council, I should say, was retiring, and that was back in October when the convention was. However, it wasn't actually, brought to the public's attention until November, and then he actually retired from the government on December 3rd, 2010, the same day as Mr. Williams did, effectively. So, I take from that, there was probably some planning in that, and so in any case, it wasn't expected. But now, then, in retrospect, when I look back on it, it was clearly well planned out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a bit of a shock throughout the province when a deal was announced, or a proposed deal, or was it a terms of reference or term sheet to go ahead with this project, and then, of course, shortly thereafter, Premier Williams announcing he was leaving prior to a deal being finalized, or all the terms and conditions established and set out. I think a lot of people. It puzzled a lot of people, and I don't know if we really have an answer to it, and we probably never will. But back on this particular deal, it from a historic point of view, in all the different governments that have come and gone since Joey Smallwood, Muskrat Falls, Gull Island, the Lower Churchill. With Muskrat Falls, it's always been seen as kind of the secondary domestic supply, and that the big project was Gull Island, and that was the one that could drive industry, or that was the one that could drive export. Did you note that in your research, and does that seem to this particular deal just seem to contradict all of that?
No, because I guess, Sue, I never really bought into the whole Gull Island promotion in any case. If you go back to, I see this really starting to happen in a serious way back in the time of Brian Tobin and his moves with Quebec and those sort of things. And back then, of course, Dean MacDonald, who is rumored to be running for the Liberal leadership, was also involved with Newfoundland Hydro. So basically, I see it starting at that point in time, and it's Gull Island. If you consider, if you think of the size of, for instance, the James Bay project in northern Quebec. The kilowatt per hour cost to produce that power, Hydro-Quebec is still losing money on that. And if memory serves me right, it's in the vicinity of around 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's a massive project. And there's a massive amount of power coming out of it, and it's being sold. But it's being sold at a loss. It's being sold at a loss of, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, like a 50% loss on the cost of producing it. The only way Hydro-Quebec actually manages to keep afloat and subsidize operations like that is by having access to that power at Upper Churchill, because they get it for 0.02 cents a kilowatt hour, and that basically subsidizes their entire operation. So when you look at that example of, say, James Bay, which is a very large, much larger than Gull, if you look at an operation like that, you go, well, Gull can produce a lot of power, but it can't produce it below the cost. It can't sell it, I should say, below or above the cost of producing it. And that's where, you keep running into a problem. Basically, hydro generation, and if you look at Newfoundland and Labrador, and Fortis, for example, Fortis is not really overly involved in the generation of power. It's the middleman, so that's where it makes money. There is no, in modern-day hydropower, as and I've studied it continentally, there's no money to be made in it. The cost of production is too high, and the profits are non-existent unless you can capture, as Quebec did, the upper Churchill and have your operations subsidized.
What I do see, and I spend a fair bit of time with it myself, as most people would know, research from an energy perspective, the way hydropower is used, let's say a project the size of Gull Island, the big avoidance always seems to be how far you have to drag it and transmit it and how much you're losing across lines and where you're bringing it to. And, of course, it's a heavy cost and a heavy maintenance cost. However, what seems to have been successful everywhere else, particularly northern countries, northern states, is they plug it into industry. And that's exactly what they do with it. They don't transmit it over a ton of lines. They don't go from one place to another place. They make a deal with industry, and that's the kind of deal we've been hearing about lately, if there's any such deal going to be made. But they take something like an aluminum smelter, make the deal to develop. They still pay for the power, but you get 1,500 to 3,000 jobs, something which Quebec is very good at. I think it values its power based on jobs per megawatt and stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of things there, but if the power never left Labrador, if the power stayed in Labrador, we really haven't heard, Brad, and I haven't heard of any attempt whatsoever to deal with industry for the use of that power at reasonable market prices. There's been where it does not have to be delivered outside of Labrador. We have heard none of that.
Well, exactly, and I think there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the government told the PUB to consider the Muskrat Falls project without the maritime link, the Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia link, because I firmly believe that link is not going to happen. And I don't know if you've noticed lately, Sue, but whenever the government's speaking about the link, the maritime link, and whenever they're speaking about Emera lately, they're talking about, well, we can create other power to send to Emera. We can use wind power to ascend on that line and meet our commitments to Emera. We can build a small plant and do that. Lately you've been hearing a lot of that. And I believe the reason for that is because the power from Muskrat Falls was and never intended to leave Labrador. I don't even believe it's coming, in fact, to the island of Newfoundland. Because I go back to there's a little bit, and I think the government's being disingenuous to the people here, because since 2003 there's been an extensive mineral exploration going on in Labrador, and the government has been fully aware of this. They've had to permit it. They've had to do environmental assessments on it. All those sort of things. So the government is fully aware of. I think, if memory serves me, there's about 13 different mining developments in progress. They didn't just come up, in the last 24 hours. They've been going on for years, and so the government is aware of that. They're aware that these companies are going to need minimum of 100 megawatts and probably the maximum of 200 megawatts apiece. So if 50% of those projects go ahead, they're going to need between 700 to 1,000 megawatts of power to supply them. Now, these companies could go to Hydro-Quebec to get their power, some of them. And so the government is basically saying, well, we want to build Muskrat Falls. We want to be the ones who supply you with power. We want to cut Hydro-Quebec out of the picture, and we're doing it, apparently to cut our nose off. It doesn't make fiscal sense to do it, especially when the mining companies. And another interesting aspect, and just stop myself for a second, but IOC, its contract is coming up for renewal with the Twin Falls Dams. And Yeah, right, Twin Falls, right. And that project there, they are going to be demanding a very, very, very cheap power source to compensate them. They've been getting, if my information is, they've been getting it at half a cent a kilowatt hour up until now. Now, when that's renegotiated, the government's only going to be able to go so high with IOC, that they will then have to apply that rate that they grant IOC to all the other mining companies that are lining up in Labrador. Whether it be Alderon, whether it be Century, or any of those groups. So what they're looking at is a massive supply of massively subsidized power for these mines, and it can't come from nowhere, and they can't afford to do Gull Island. They can maybe scrape by with Muskrat Falls. And so this is where I think that power is destined. Otherwise, they would have to explain how they plan on supplying power to all these mining operations that are either going ahead or in the midst of going ahead. It's only common sense.
Well, there
really.
was there was, going back to all of the other attempts and studies and economic reviews, and there's been a lot, obviously, of the lower Churchill. And Gull Island would be the cheaper power to produce if you were to follow that. And so then you have to look at then why Muskrat and why not Gull Island, and then there's, we have to look at what is CFLCO's role. Hydro-Quebec owns a third of that. Now, if we don't want them wheeling power back in here, or we want high rents on transmission, there's so many different things that have to be considered. But Gull Island, primarily was always looked at from the standpoint of an industrial base because it's the cheaper power to produce. So now we've gone to the more expensive power that was usually destined for domestic supply, and that was, Brad, through the years and years and years that they were predicting that the population was going to increase and industry was going to grow, particularly on the island, of course, as they always assume. And of course, none of that ever happened. In fact, we've lost industry and lost plants and lost paper mills, shutting down schools. There's these things didn't come through fruition, but this was the Muskrat plan, and Gull Island was industrial. But again, I say that regardless of what they're putting forth now, this is my own personal opinion, appears to be the most expensive. The least beneficial option for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, and we're going from exporting power, Emera having its chunk for Nova Scotia, then being able to take power and drive it down through New England, and then other power now going to mines, and all this on Muskrat Falls with transmission lines going everywhere, the cost of which is astronomical. I don't know if I could have come up with a more expensive project with the least return. That's what it seems like we have. That's really what it is in the nutshell. If you look at Gull Island, it's a cheaper project by the kilowatt hour, but right. You have to remember that it also produces, if memory serves, 3 times the power that Muskrat Falls would. Well, so, in essence, what we were saying is if the mines, let's say the mines we're looking at, and not only the mines that are there, but if we were looking at, forgetting this total extraction of natural resources, but let's say we actually went into secondary processing of material, which is where we should have gone ages and ages ago, but let's say we looked at a secondary processing plant like an aluminum smelter, then it becomes a different kettle of fish, because an aluminum smelter could, in effect, take 3/4 of a power supply from a Gull Island.
Right. I think though when you're looking at the cost of Gull Island, insofar as being cheaper by the kilowatt hour, is true, and perhaps that would be less of a subsidy that people would have to pay to fund those mines so they can operate. But I think what it boils down to was the initial cash outlay to build it. It would be more expensive to build Gull Island because it's virtue of its size than it would be. So, what they're basically doing it on the cheap by doing Muskrat Falls, and for the time being,
and that probably just even costs us more, Brad. If I can just interrupt for a minute, because again, I go back to, we don't have information saying we spoke to aluminum smelting companies. We spoke to Alcoa and they said no. What I do know, and we all know, is that in Russia, in Iceland, Quebec, Ontario, many northern countries, hydropower and aluminum smelters have gone hand in hand for 25 years, and they are heavy power users, and they're paying what I call market price plus, of course, a contribution of employment and investment. But none of this seems to be discussed. As you said, they went on the cheap or going to the Muskrat project, but in the end, it's really shutting down industrial potential.
Well, that would be if the industrial potential were ever what was behind it in the first place. If you look at the federal government, there's a port in Sept-Îles, Quebec, that that all this iron ore is going to be going down to be shipped in raw material to either China or for Tata Steel, it's going to go to Europe. So the federal government just put in $55 million to do a port expansion in there. The total cost of the port expansion is about $200 million. The feds put in $55 million. Alderon, as a mining company, had to put in $20 million, of which they had to borrow from one of their investors and have since paid back. But basically, it's the concept of, as you know, in the old military thing, I would say it's the concept of operations. And I think the concept of operations in Labrador, it's becoming pretty clear, is to pull the material out and ship it in the cheapest possible fashion, and refining it has got absolutely nothing to do in the equation. It's just not even a factor.
Yeah, you're right, and that's where that's another place we're running into problems. When we talk about, fueling mines and, ore extraction, as opposed to the secondary processing, because, Brad, that's where the long-term jobs are, obviously. That's where the development of an economy is, and that's usually where hydropower shows up, and the benefit of which, I think, I don't know what Hydro-Quebec-related jobs are, probably around 40,000. That's where employment shows up. So, the fact that we have, and I remember this, and I'm sure most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians do, this whole business surrounding Voisey's Bay, and,
right.
Well, we can't do anything. We've got to make sure we have secondary processing, have to make sure we have guaranteed jobs. We're not letting anything else go out of here unprocessed. Well, there's a couple of things with that. Number one, all the mines you were just talking about, of course, that's the common theme, ship the ore out. But, so that's gone to all of a sudden, all those principles of, making that the starting point, that we will be masters in our own house or of our own house or whatever it was.
Right.
All this was based on taking an ore body and making it into something. And the secondary is, when people talk about hydropower, those that are involved in heavy hydropower production, hydropower is in fact, and also a primary resource, and exported out does nothing to add value to that primary resource, which is hydropower that's being produced. The minute you plug it into something that's going to do secondary production, then you have something rolling, and you can expect, an input of population, growth of small to medium-sized business. But none of that is being talked about, Brad. None of it is on the table.
I think I have an answer for you for that particular point, and frankly, it boils down to business and a convergence of interests, like-minded interests, but not like-minded people. People need to understand that what's happening, and the people in Labrador probably, already understand that. People who aren't in Labrador might, need to know that, for instance, there is a company called Century Mining, which is Chinese, which has taken over, I believe, 4 or 5 of Altius Minerals iron ore prospects in Labrador. They are also, of course, in with Alderon in a different fashion, but it's still Chinese. There's Tata Steel that's in with New Millennium Group, is basically taking over their 2 projects. So you've got India wanting to ship raw ore to their plants in Europe. And you've got China that not necessarily wants to ship, but wants to lock up ore resources. Then, on top of that, you have our local guys. You've got, I call them local guys, but in Toronto, you've got a company called Forbes and Manhattan Group. They were the guys behind Mr. Tobin and the mine he was involved with. They're Thompson Consolidated. They're the same people. They're the same people who are now involved in Alderon. They're also the same people that are getting involved in a company called CapEx, which is a new mining development in Labrador. They're also the same people that are involved with uranium projects. They were behind Aurora, which Steve McDonald was, appointed to and then unappointed to in 2 days. They're behind all these other companies. They're very involved in the mining aspects in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so their drive is, and it's business for them. Their drive is to get in when it's very early and get the stocks, anywhere from 1 to 10 cents a share, and then turn around, get it up to a point where they call it de-risking it, where a big player can come in, walk in, take it over, put up the $1 billion to build a mine, and then they get their $15 a share cut, and they leave, and that's how they make money. And so this sort of is driving Newfoundland and Labrador mining right now. And these are the guys, frankly, who are driving it. And so between their business drive to make those profits, and they could care less about, frankly, it's business to them. Making jobs and, and all that sort of secondary processing, if they don't, that's not part of their strategic position or view. That's also not part of China's or India's. As a matter of fact, Tata Steel is developing their mining sites in Labrador specifically to ship the ore to Europe for their plants in Europe. All their plants in India are supplied by Indian iron ore. So, but they wanted
Brad,
a secure source.
And you're right in saying, and I give some leeway this way, and I say this: a business's role, particularly something publicly traded, is certainly to make the most money it can for its shareholders. That's its role. It has no social role. It has no role to create or develop communities or grow communities or grow population or provide money to a treasury for health and education. But we do know that the Progressive Conservative Party, when in opposition, it was exactly their point. It was exactly their point that everything and every natural resource was to do exactly what you just said. Of course, businesses are not interested in doing, nor do they have a mandate to do, nor is it, their fiduciary responsibility. They have no fiduciary responsibility to us. They have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. So they're doing what they're doing, and they're coming into a province that has changed in, 7, 8 years from everything must have secondary processing, everything must be to the maximum benefit of the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, to ship it out. So,
right. And,
and we're only hearing about our fish now today, right? Send the fish out.
Yes.
Let's send it. So we're talking about a party who fundamentally came to office after spending a year, 2 years, preaching that everything must have, that is, our natural resources must have secondary processing. They must be primarily for the benefit of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. And we've come to, now we have what? Our premier is what now? The CEO of an unknown publicly traded company? I just can't follow where the logic is, and in fact we're getting ourselves in a lot of trouble by forgetting that very basic principle.
Well, I think, frankly, so I think, in 2003, like I said earlier, there was a sudden interest in exploring in a serious way in Labrador for iron ore. And that coincides, and it just coincides with the election of the new government. However, since that point in time, that government, the PC government, has gotten very close to these iron ore companies. They've taken them to China. They've been involved with them in other ventures. The government of Newfoundland and Labrador asked Altius Minerals to get involved with creating Newfoundland and Labrador refinery company that would propose a refinery up near Arnold's Cove. So, and that failed, and it failed miserably. So they have a very close link to these mining companies. I mean, it's a matter of public record. Anybody can go in, Google them, and see the different trade missions and the relationships. And now, of course, since Mr. Williams left office, his clerk of the Executive Council 6 months later joined Alderon as their Vice President of Government Relations. Then shortly after he joined, the Vice President in charge of Aboriginal Affairs and Environment from Nalcor joined Alderon. And then shortly after that, on December the 22nd, 2011, Mr. Williams was contracted as a strategic advisor for Alderon. And on the same day, his longtime companion, Elizabeth Matthews, was also hired as a strategic PR person for Alderon. So, and on top of that, I guess, I might as well say that Mr. Williams also was granted 1,150,000 share options, more than any other officer or any other director was ever granted for joining Alderon. So, there becomes, a certain pattern, and, a reasonable person would start to ask questions about these things. And, if you look at the pace that the government's trying to push Muscat Falls through, and a lot of people say, well, what's the hurry? Why are they in such a hurry? Well, frankly, a lot of these mining developments, they're on schedules, and they're on schedules they want to be up and developing by, say, 2015, 2016, 2017. So in order to meet that commitment and that electrical power commitment, they need Muskrat Falls up and operating on schedule. And so, they do an injustice to the people to come up with all these ridiculous comments about, oh, it's the environment, and we're going to be hooked up to this, and we're going to be that, and the other thing. I mean, they're ridiculous, and frankly, I'll give you one example of it. It just blows me away. I was reading the EIS, the Environmental Impact Study for Alderon that they submitted to the government, and they estimate in the first part of their phase of operations, they're going to need basically 100 megawatts of power. They are going to use 65 of that with electrical power, but 35 megawatts of it, they're going to build their own oil-burning, facility to power part of their operations, because it would be cheaper than using electrical power. So how that makes sense, I don't know. But when we go on about what we're doing this for the environment, well, there's a company, that's just one example of how they plan on setting up an oil-burning plant. On another flip, if you think about the environmental side of it, it's almost comical. If we stopped, for instance, pulling oil off the offshore for 4 days, that would be all the oil that consumed at Holyrood in a year. If we were concerned about the environment, would we be opening up 15 open pit mines all across Labrador and damming rivers? It just boggles the mind that they think and treat people that stupidly. You tell them what you want and they'll buy it, and their arguments are absolutely ridiculous and insulting. And so anyway, I get back to the real reason, and it'll come through in the end. People will see it. It'll come through in the end. For instance, Amira now is saying we're opting out, and we're waiting until 2014 before we have to opt in. So we're letting things go along the road and going, well, geez, this and that's going to happen, but the evidence the evidence on the ground points to that the government is known for at least a decade about the mining power requirements of Labrador. There's not enough power for Muskrat Falls to supply both the mines and Nova Scotia. And so, it's just common sense. It's just deduction, It's mathematics.
Well, when we look at Alderon's own commentary on the Canny property and what has to fall in place and the infrastructure that's needed, of course, one of which is energy supply, and that, costs and timing and complexities are going to play a very real role, and if anything goes wrong here, it will have a material, adverse effect on the company.
Exactly.
So they say that, and then, and so we know where they're coming from. We know what they need, and time is of the essence, and their infrastructure is of the essence, or, according to them, it's going to really cause, and this is their own words, cause them a real problem to operate and continue. And then when we take, Alderaan, like any corporation of its type, has corporate governance. And, people go in there on the board of directors, and they go in there under corporate governance. And so then, we have to look at when Danny Williams speaks. Danny Williams is a director of Alderaan. That is just the way it is. And when we read something that says, such conflicting loyalties can cause an employee, director, officer, or consultant to give preference to personal interests in situations where corporate responsibility should come first. Let's make no mistake what they say. Employees, officers, directors, and consultants of the company shall perform the responsibilities of their position on the basis of what is in the best interest of the company and free from the influence of personal considerations and relationships. So we understand fully that he would be there in a position in the board of directors where the company comes first. The company made it clear what it needs in order to be able to carry on, survive, and thrive. So we know what it is they want. And he's a director. I mean, we can't fool ourselves on something that they clearly articulate themselves.
Exactly. And, I was espousing it basically since January. And then, what was it, a few months back when Alderaan had their annual meeting in Strong, and they laid it out for us. They confirmed it. If we don't have the power, we can't do the deal. If we don't have Muskrat Falls power, we can't go to double our production that we need to do, and we're going to our operations in jeopardy. They also did say the very same thing in their publicly registered reports and returns that they're required by the stock exchange. So that's a fact. They've stated. Not only did they say that, but they said, guess what? And Williams actually said it himself here last week at the board trade speech. He said, if those mines in Labrador need Muskrat Falls power. Those are out of his lips, So I think that's a given. I really, now that we basically outed them into, discussing it, they try to spin around and say, well, look, there's another reason, as if that weren't the reason in the first place,
Well,
and
when I read someone's own statement, and it says to me that they need to enter into contracts with external service and utility providers, and that the failure to do so is going to materially adverse the business, prospects, financial position, results of operation, and cash flows. I'm
right.
seeing a very serious position. And when someone is speaking and is a director of that company, they must, because corporate governance dictates that they do, put the best interests of the company first.
Well, I listened to Mr. Williams, and I listened to him say that he wouldn't put his reputation on the line for Muskrat Falls or for a mining company, for anything. But, I've got a problem with Mr. Williams because, have you read the New Dawn Agreement, Sue?
Partially.
To read it over? Okay. Well, in the New Dawn Agreement, it speaks to the sale of potential future sale of shares in CFLCO, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And, which, should raise some alarm bells for some people. I mean, that's a crown corporation. Who are they going to sell it to? And why were they planning back in 2008 or 2009 when they signed the New Dawn Agreement or they drafted the New Dawn Agreement to sell those shares? But then I just received a copy 2 days ago of the 1999 shareholders agreement between Hydro-Quebec and CFLCO. And right. And funny enough, Hydro-Quebec in that agreement has first rights to buy any shares that are put up for sale of CFLCO.
There's a lot of stuff in.
I'm thinking to myself.
There's a lot of stuff there, Brad. I mean, and it gets worse.
But my question is, Well, my question is, I know there's a lot of stuff in that agreement, but I guess my point is that on the one hand, Mr. Williams is going around to the entire province and country saying Quebec's the boogeyman. They're keeping us down in the dirt and all the rest of it. And on the flip side of it, and back in 2008, 2009, when he was doing this agreement with the Innu people, he knew that he had to offer those shares to Hydro-Quebec first of CFLCO, which would strengthen their position. So, on the one side, he's speaking out of one side of his mouth. And on the other side, in reality, and if you look at the writing and you read the dot the I's across the T's, you can see that, guess what? He's not being quite frank with people in that regard. And then on the other side of it, I have not yet, and maybe you have, Sue, but I haven't yet, heard him declare publicly that he's a shareholder in Alderon, how much of a shareholder he is, how much he gets paid as a consultant, when he started getting paid as a consultant, and his family members that are employed there. Now, I haven't heard any of that kind of disclosure from him that would allow people to see what he's saying in a proper light. All I hear from him is...
Here's the thing, Brad, is that when people leave public life, and this is something that the people have to get their heads around, when people leave public life, of course, the person that's left can say, it's my business, it's my business, it's my business. And, the only thing that we can do, and certainly I brought it up before, is anyone willing to talk about what it is they now own or are involved in, or, talk about it openly or freely. And, of course, if the answer is no, then the answer is no. And we can believe or understand what we want to believe and understand. And really, there's, not going to be, unless it's offered up by the individual themselves, a proper inventory of what may or may not be invested in or owned, or whatever the case might be. But that's what happens. I mean, so it does nothing for me. I mean, until or unless someone comes out and says to me, well, I am involved, that is to say I own shares in this, this, and this, or I am not involved, I don't own shares in this, this, and this, I just assume what intelligently I can assume from the information that's out there. And I'm a person, I'm therefore a virtual shareholder in the resources, obviously, as a person in the province of these resources and the development. And I just have to take stuff that I see as a reasonably minded person. I can read what I read, I can see what I see, and I have to make, decisions on my own, unless somebody is going to come out and, like I said, declare yay or nay on they own or don't own, and that person is in private life, and I have no right or entitlement to that information. I have to make the calls myself. But, when we talk about this relationship with Quebec, and we talk about, changes that you spoke earlier about the Upper Churchill and the Upper Churchill deal, and then, of course, when they made the guaranteed winter availability contract, it's the first time in my knowledge, when people say, well, we can't change the deal, the deal is stuck, we're stuck with it, here's what it is. Well, there was a fundamental change in that deal, because when the guaranteed winter availability contract was put in place, when GWAC came in, there was also a change in the management rights allotted to Hydro-Quebec. So when we say something can't be changed, or it never will be changed, or it wasn't changed, well, guess what? It was changed. So the question then becomes, okay, they changed it on their end. How do we change it on our end? And what has happened to all of that? And at that time, of course, it would have been Dean MacDonald, as I guess he would have been the chair of Newfoundland Labrador Hydro at the time, or CEO. I think it was the chair. I'm not sure, but he was there, and then of course that would have been under Brian Tobin, and attempting to do. I don't know how many rivers were involved, Brad, but there were many rivers involved, including the Romaine, which Quebec has gone on now and done itself. But all the rivers involved, Brad, that were there, and they, this is with Premier Bouchard at the time, and they landed in Labrador and had their big announcement, and then everything went bust on that. However, Quebec changed the management structure of CFLCO.
Exactly. And, I listened, you brought Mr. MacDonald up, and it's good that he should be brought up, because he's relevant in the political life today, and he had an impact back then in the history books. And, Mr. McDonald presided over the 1999 shareholders agreement between Hydro-Quebec and CFLCO, which essentially gave, this is what it gave Hydro-Quebec from my understanding of it. It gave Hydro-Quebec the first right of refusal to buy any shares that became available in CFLCO. It gave Hydro-Quebec the right to veto any substantial change in the business structure of CFLCO or the Upper Churchill. It gave Hydro-Quebec the right to veto any debts or major debts incurred by CFLCO. Basically what it did is it gave Hydro-Quebec a stranglehold on CFLCO acting outside of Quebec's interests.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was quite the like, okay, let me just say this, Brad. Had all the rivers been developed together and this super project gone ahead as an agreement between Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland Labrador Hydro or CFLCO, it had this new thing all come into place. And what Lucien Bouchard and Brian Tobin were talking about, well, we've got the big deal, all of Lower Churchill is going to be developed, and I think there's 3 or 4 other rivers, and we're going to make the assets work together, and we're going to, have this super project. So for that, of course, we would be looking at, well, now we're into a partnership that is much larger, so let's look at the management structure of what we have and what we have the right to say yay or nay to. Unfortunately, the big project got dropped, but the management structure change is there. And this is something that Dean MacDonald did preside over.
Exactly. That was going to be my next point, that although he surrendered, essentially seriously surrendered the rights of Newfoundlanders and Labradors in CFLCO as far as my interpretation of that agreement goes. I think most reasonable people's interpretation would go. He didn't even get the deal in the end. So Hydro-Quebec managed to get CFLCO to agree to the bad terms and not come through with the cake in the end. So
well, what's interesting, Brad, is it also is, because in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, what we've heard since the deal was struck and we realized how bad it was, what we've always heard is that you can't change it, there's no way out of it. But, of course, that deal was fundamentally changed because it gave them those management rights that they did not have prior, and essentially their veto rights, because if they say nay, there's nothing we can do about it. And that's not something that's discussed, and I don't like it not being discussed because it is a very material and real change to the relationship that we have with Hydro-Quebec. And frankly, see, Brad, if we talked about that stuff sort of openly and said, look, here's what's written, because it's not too hard to read what's written, and you're right on any reasonably minded person, it's like you take that, and you know what's being said there. You know that the change is significant. You know that it's a material change. And then from there, let's say you're going to go up now and talk to them about a development, or say we'd like to run some power through, or real power through Quebec, or do this or do that. I think if we were to look at what potentially could be a problem, is those changes could very well be a problem. Those changes could have put them in even a stronger position, if that's even imaginable, from the position they had with the Upper Churchill. And, they're not prepared and willing again to give up what they negotiated fairly, because everyone goes back and says, well, no one would have guessed the price of oil. Well, clearly Quebec did. They financed the Upper Churchill, so clearly they've seen something in the offing. But anyway, we didn't see that, and there's no escalator clause and all that. So we'll never, ever, ever, ever do that again. But in 1999, we waltzed back in and gave them management authority and rights they did not have before. So
exactly.
We've got to do some serious. We've got to do some serious talking in order for us to understand what really is the relationship with Hydro-Quebec.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that first of all and foremost, I think that is like a lot of things I've noticed in Newfoundland and Labrador politics and history. There's things that people just don't want to admit to, quite frankly, because, they don't want to be diminished in the people's eyes. But quite frankly, Mr. MacDonald, and I suppose you could say Mr. Tobin at the time, gave away even more rights to Hydro-Quebec to strangulate, if they wanted to, any operations out of the Upper Churchill. Now, Mr. MacDonald today, in a reincarnation, is out there saying, well, first of all, he killed the deal that would have at least given something for what he did in 1990. He killed Roger Grimes' deal. But beyond that, he's out there today and he's saying, well, we got to have Muskrat Falls. We got to have Muskrat Falls, And it's interesting because I looked at Mr. Grimes' deal. I had to look at it because it was put up there a little while ago. I had to look at it. And Mr. Grimes' deal, I was trying to see, well, what could Mr. MacDonald find that was so objectionable in that deal? What was so objectionable? And the only thing I could come up with is that Hydro-Quebec was only going to allow a recall power of a staged recall. So, in 5 years you could have, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was about 150 megawatts. And in 10 years we'll grant you another 200 megawatts to that. And in 15 years we'll grant you another 300. So that didn't leave enough megawatts for them to develop the mining projects going on in Labrador at that time. It was right around that, just after, in that time that they started really prospecting up there. That's about the only thing that I could find in that deal with Mr. Grimes that was objectionable in any way.
It's funny because
now,
it was 100% ownership for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, and that should be stated first. It was an interesting project or proposal. We'll call it a proposal because, of course, it hadn't gone through the sanctioning process that we've seen with this current proposal. And had it gone through that process, perhaps things might have changed or been negotiated. But there were some very, very beneficial parts of that. But again, see, Brad, it took on a fictitious life. It took on a fictitious, like that deal, for instance, the proposed deal under Premier Grimes was talked about without any meat. For instance, I've often suggested, I know others have, that the media put the two deals up side by side and see what we're looking at, and actually compare the deals and see what we're talking about on a dollar basis, a job basis. I mean, what's coming to this province, what benefit, what's the cost to us, what's our debt load, is it going to increase the cost of domestic supply, and so on. Let's look at what the two deals are. But there's kind of been a refusal to really put that out side by side. And so we've lived in this kind of fiction where nobody really knows, and all I hear conclusively from those people who carry on from that fiction is, my gosh, we could have had Roger Grimes' deal. It would have been awful. And then you ask them what the deal was, and they have no idea.
Right. And I think that's part of sort of what I'm getting at with the political spin of it, with Mr. MacDonald, with Mr. Williams, these type of things, because you've got people who are trying to essentially ingratiate themselves, if you will, to the people in Newfoundland and Labrador, conveniently forgetting that they were the very same people. As I said about Mr. Williams, he was, by virtue of that New Dawn agreement, he was prepared to sell those shares in CFLCO to Hydro-Quebec. And Mr. MacDonald, by virtue of the 1999 agreement, he gave Hydro-Quebec a stranglehold that they never had on the administration of CFLCO, and therefore on the Upper Churchill, and therefore on the development of Labrador. So, these gentlemen have a cross to bear that they, for some reason, seem to forget is there or hope it'll go away. And these are the same people that are these are the people who are hurting Newfoundland and Labrador, because it seems to me that, frankly, their actions in the past have not really benefited the people, and any reasonably minded person could easily come to that conclusion. And now they're proposing a project that is obviously not going to earn enough money for its keep. It's obviously there specifically to subsidize the mining operations, and it's almost like it's some sort of a strategic kind of industrial development sort of thing from the old Soviet days almost. I don't want to get too dramatic with it, but it's, the mines are more important than the people who will pay for it. That type of mentality, as opposed to, let's use oil profits to reduce debt. Let's use oil profits to put ourselves in a strong financial position. No, let's spend it all. And these mining gentlemen and countries are going to benefit. And the people in Newfoundland and Labrador going to pay for it because nobody else is.
Yes, see, Brad, if the deal was we're looking at mines now, and the reason why is because they're going to set up secondary processing in Labrador, we'd have something that we'd all like to talk about. But that's not what we're talking about.
No,
and
it's not.
Secondary processing, that is to say, yes, we're going to develop energy, and we're going to develop energy because you know what? We have a commitment to secondary processing. In the same way they demanded it at Voisey's Bay, if the ore is going to come out, we want a secondary processing facility. We want the jobs, the long-term jobs that are involved in secondary processing. We're not satisfied, they used to say, at construction jobs, just the construction, or digging the ore out and shipping it away. We want post-secondary. Right. I mean, they spent 2 terms in opposition in the House of Assembly filled with this mantra. And now, if what we're looking at is supplying mines that are going to dig ore out and ship it off, and the processing is not done, well, you see, that's a total. That's totally contrary, Brad, to what they laid on the table for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador when they made the Mack Truck statements about the Voisey's Bay deal, when they questioned doing a research and development project with respect to processing and the type of processing that would be done on the ore body. All of that stuff was thrown under the bus. And no, we want the maximum of everything, and we're just not seeing any of that.
Well, I think, and here's one thing that I don't know if people are aware of or not, but to bring that power, for instance, up from Muskrat Falls to the Upper Churchill, they're building 2 huge line systems, both of them capable of handling 900 megawatts for the complete production of Muskrat Falls. Secondly, from the Upper Churchill, they're looking at running lines out to the mining companies. And the mining company, Alderon and its EIS, estimated that the provincial government, Nalcor, is going to have to spend up to $150 million for that in particular line. That's not included, by the way, in any sort of DG3 numbers or anything else. It's just sort of a separate cost. So there's all kinds of things going on associated with the Muskrat Falls project that are being placed outside of it in the ways of costs. So there's should the people in Newfoundland and Labrador be paying $150 million for a power line from the Upper Churchill to Alderon and a couple other mining companies? I mean, I think but nobody's even talking about it because it hasn't been brought to anyone's attention.
Well,
and
sorry, go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to say that, we're running into these problems. The companies don't care. They're there to make what they call shareholder value. They're there to put in 10 cents on the shares, get out with $15 on the share. That's the only thing they care about. They don't care about, frankly, anything to do with, like you say, the social, economic life of the people there, or quality of life, or, that sort of thing. Their primary concern is, fiduciary concern, you said earlier, is to add value to their shareholders. And that's it. And that's all they really care about. They're in business. And
well,
that's
yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to sit here I'm not going to sit here and fault the business, because the business is doing exactly what it's mandated to do, and the officers of the business are doing exactly what they're mandated to do. The question I have, and I'm sure a question a lot of people in this province, of course, you have, others have, is what is the government tasked to do? What is its mandate? What is its social responsibility? What is its commitment to industrial development and value-added jobs and long-term growth and coffers and royalties and maximizing royalties? I mean, we're not talking about royalties here at the time. We're talking about a ton of debt. But Brad, we're into about let me see here. We got about a half an hour left, and I'd like to segue into this if you wouldn't mind. I'm going to ask you another question there now and let you have some time on this. But I did want to just advise our listeners that a number of concerned people in the province, and people, I guess the average citizens of Newfoundland and Labrador, have had a lot of concerns and a lot of questions, and whether it's I just can't see this project at all, or you're not giving me the information I need, or you're preventing the information from coming to me through things such as Pub, have started an online site called Stand in Your Place NL. And on that site, there's a petition where the person signs to support either a Public Utilities Board review, a public referendum, or both, to allow us processes to get some more of this information talked about, some of the stuff we're talking about tonight, and other things that would go through in these sort of processes. One, of course, for the ratepayer, being PUB, and the other for the average citizen of Newfoundland and Labrador in the public referendum, and allow some of this free flow dialogue to occur. And I just want to give out that address, and the address the address online is standinyourplacenl.com. So I just wanted to put that out there before I segued into my next question for you. And the next question basically, Brad, is what do you think about the process to date?
I've never seen, well, I shouldn't say never. I guess I could go back to the Meech Lake Accord. But beyond the Meech Lake Accord, I don't think I've seen such an abuse of the democratic process in my life, watching and studying politics, and that's really saying something. I think, it's one thing, generally speaking, governments are permitted, if they win an election, they have a majority, they're permitted to, implement their programs in a general sense. But when you're speaking about one project, essentially coming close to doubling the gross debt of the province, the devastating effects that has on the future economic development, investment, taxation, all those sort of things, it's outrageous that the people wouldn't get a say on that because it's such a huge commitment. If you consider that, I've heard Randy Sims and I've heard other radio show people say, well, it's like a house. You invest in it, you have equity. It's not really costing you anything. Well, I'm tempted to come phone into them and say, have you ever heard of such a thing as being house poor? And I'm sure people out there can relate to that. You have a mortgage regardless of what your property is worth, regardless of the credit line you put up against your property. You've got bills to pay, and those come out of your revenues, and those revenues have to be there, or else, you lose your house. So it's a very, very, very faulty logic that's driving some of these gentlemen to make some of these statements. And I think that people out there need to truly understand the economic impact this will have intergenerationally. It's not just something, for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, there'll be good employment building it. But after that, for instance, the Nalcor has admitted that the maximum number of jobs combined out of the two Lower Churchill, like the two dams on the Lower Churchill, the Gall and Muskrat Falls, is going to be 80 jobs. 80 jobs for $10 billion, a long-term jobs. So, direct jobs. But, the point is that what these guys are doing in the Newfoundland PUC party today is that basically what they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're hyperinflating the economy here. We're building. I mean, they've got to the point where they've lost the Hebron module because they can't fulfill it. There's systemic problems. And on the flip side of that inflation is increasing, for instance, the value of your house. So that's going to increase your property tax. And so a lot of people now are, including businesses, mind you, are going to be facing higher leases to compensate. So, and there goes the rent. And, you get into an inflationary spiral upwards. And that tends to kill growth. Eventually it will. And that's what Newfoundland and Labrador is heading for. At the same time, like you said earlier, we have the demographics. 150,000 people left Newfoundland and Labrador between 1985 and 1995. There's a huge hole in the demographic chart. And that's now coming to bear because that generation that would have been there to help support and pay taxes is gone. And most of them haven't come back. They might come back to retire, and that's about it. But most don't. So, we're having a whole combination of things hitting Newfoundland and Labrador all at one time. And on top of that, they're throwing this project on top of it. And it defies any economic sense I've ever seen anywhere on any level. And we're seeing that. You're seeing talking about bringing Filipinos in to work in the mines, and you're talking about people are starting to phone into radio shows now and going, boy, my property tax assessment's gone up 40%. What's happening? Well, that's what's happening. And And then you've got, Mr. Williams. He wants to build another city onto St. John's. That's going to drive up inflation. And so people are getting hurt on a number of different angles. And now with Muskrat Falls, it's going to impact what you're going to pay on your taxes as well as what you're going to pay on your utility bill. And I remember last Christmas, 2 days before Christmas, I was at the bank, and there was this elderly lady there. She must have been at least 80, and she was at the till beside me, and she just cashed her CPP check, and she had a handful of fives. She was going to give her grandchildren for Christmas, and she said, I just paid my power bill off, and I've got $100 left over for the month. And here's an 80-year-old lady. I'm sure she probably has a little house somewhere in the Cove or wherever, and she's paid for. But most of her money, her CPP, is going to heat her house, and that is as it is now, not as it will be. And so, when I remember that lady, that's what sort of drives me in fighting this, because that is just tragic, and it's sad, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen in a fair and democratic province country, And when I reflect on where this project is coming from, the greed, the corporate drive, China and India wanting those ore for their plants, that really bothers me. There's something very wrong about sacrificing your own people that way for the almighty dollar and to make these other interests, satisfy these other interests. And that's, I think, what people really need to reflect on.
When we talk about processes that are there, let's say, to protect the people, ratepayer, taxpayer, first of all, of course, we have the federal, provincial environmental impact in that process. We have a Public Utilities Board, and clearly, I think there's a need for the Public Utilities Board to protect the consumer, to protect the ratepayer, to do as it does with any other application, and have the free ability to assess and judge as it sees fit in its assessment. Just a couple of questions directly to you. A normal, unimpeded public review, Public Utilities Board review, is that absolutely necessary? What would be your take on that?
I would think a review that involves all possible options, and that would include, a power purchase agreement with Hydro-Quebec or whatever will be cheapest for the people, including that 80-year-old lady I was standing beside in the bank. That's what I would say. If it's all-encompassing review, then fine. It should be done. It should have been done before now. It should have been done before Muskrat Falls started getting any blades to make roads in.
And when we talk about, let's just go, okay, so that's that part. That's one process. Now, let's talk about the utilities' responsibility, as they have in, of course, other provinces and other places around the world. First thing before anything else is considered for domestic supply development is conservation. How satisfied are you that Newfoundland and Labrador has gone through a conservation process with the utilities?
Well, not very. There's been no real great program that I've seen in my neck of the woods in Newfoundland, and I'm assuming the rest to promote insulating, to promote any type of conservation really at all. To be honest, the major conservation effort I can see is through sheer need and people cutting wood to burn for the winter because they can't afford the power rates. It's that kind of conservation driven by poverty, to be honest. But I haven't seen any government programs specifically designed to sort of educate people or help people, compensate people, get them going in that direction. No.
Well, and we call a spade too. Prior to the break-off of talks with Hydro-Quebec, if that's what we want to call them, and certainly termed by the government, there was no urgent need for power, keep bricks in the bed, we're going to run out. And certainly if utilities felt essentially that we're running out of power, because this issue never came up until the purported breakdown in talks with Hydro-Quebec, and all of a sudden it became an emergency. And then looking at advanced and developed nations around the world, including some jurisdictions within our own country, first and foremost, about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro would have had to be running around mad going, we need conservation, things are getting tight, and while we're developing what we're going to do, we really need to focus now, as all advanced nations are doing, on the conservation of energy rather than, go use more, we'll build more, and that sort of mentality, which is long since gone. We didn't see any of that. You have any speculation on that? What's your feeling on it?
Well, I think, if you take Nalcor's own numbers, consumption of power in Newfoundland and Labrador has actually decreased to this year as the same rate of consumption that was in place in 1992, 20 years ago. So consumption of power in Newfoundland and Labrador has decreased massively since 2003. And we're back to where we were basically, like I said, 1992. So I do not buy into the whole war cry that we need power. If the mines and when the mines start to progress in Labrador, then there'll be a need for power. But it won't be because there's a need for power on the island. It'll be because there's a need for power in Labrador to power the mines. That's simple as that. If you look at the demographics of where the province is going, within the next 15 to 20 years, Newfoundland and Labrador's population will probably be in the vicinity of about 430,000 people. There's to be quite frank with you, there's a serious demographic problem in Newfoundland and Labrador that's going to be reflected in the rest of the Western world as well. But right now, it's most predominant in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the consumption of residential power, which according to MHI, they said, I believe it was 50% of the power consumed in Newfoundland and Labrador is residential in nature. If you consider that your population is going to decrease by 20 to 25% within the next 20 to 25 years, your domestic, obviously, that part of your business is gone. So then you're looking at, well, where is the business? Well, the business will be in Labrador, and but what I'm trying to say, I suppose, in effect, is that there's no need for Newfoundland and Labrador to have power, but there will be a need for mines to have power, and that's basically why, as far as I'm concerned, that they're doing away with things like the natural gas, because that supplies the Avalon where the power is really needed is in Labrador, not on the island.
Yeah, I mean, now I'm going to go to I guess a part of your history. As a very young mayor, you were involved in a referendum process on the Meech Lake Accord.
Hello?
And this is something that we hear numbers of people, citizens saying, let's go to a referendum on this. How did that referendum process work with you at the municipal level, and do you see any benefit having a referendum on this issue now?
Well, I'll give you a quick one on that. What it was I was really perturbed with the way Meech Lake was being handled, as I think most people were. It was a backroom deal. It was all shut doors and everything else. And I thought, well, you know what? Quebec keeps saying it has a referendum, a right to a referendum, even though, it's a constitutional question. It's not enshrined in law or in the Constitution at that time specifically. And so I said, well, we'll have a referendum here. It's not what we're entitled to do, but we'll sort of poke a bit of fun at them by doing it, saying, well, if you can have one illegally, we can have one illegally. But anyway, that's just a short aside. Essentially, what it boils down to, it's a simple thing. Most provinces, you just follow your Elections Act. It's a simple process. I think there has to be safeguards on spending, obviously, and we've seen a hint of that with the business community spending on the I Believe program and with public relations firms and so forth. So I think there has to be some safeguards there. But I will tell you myself, and I don't know if your viewers are aware of this, but I did serve on Nalcor and the provincial government last week a notice letter that I was planning on challenging charter challenge on the way they've conducted Muskrat Falls and on a referendum. And, essentially what it boils down to is that during the New Dawn Agreement, they gave the the Innu Nation, they recognized the Innu Nation, and they even came forward and said that Muskrat Falls development depends on this vote. Now, that vote was not required. It was not. The New Dawn Agreement is only an agreement in principle. It's not a final agreement. There's no requirement by the federal government that there be a referendum. And part of that agreement was what we call an IBA, like basically an impact benefits agreement.
Yep.
That is not a land claim, and that's a totally separate agreement. It's not a land claim at all. In that agreement, it says that agreement on ratification means that the Innu agree with the project going ahead. And my argument with the court is going to be that because this was not a legally required referendum, and because the provincial government recognized it as a referendum de facto on the progress of Muskrat Falls, that the people of Newfoundland and Labrador should also be entitled to that same right. And that's under, I will be arguing that under Section 24.1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under the issue of equality.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting, Brad, because when we talk about a true referendum process, one of which, of course, we've seen in British Columbia, and they have a mechanism, of course, to demand a referendum. But when they went through it on the HST, and we've seen people step to the plate, and information was forthcoming, and funds are available for the other side to do research and get information out, and it becomes a very free flow conversation where there's a little more equality in trying to balance yay or nay, for or against, and it allows time for people to consume an awful lot of information that's out there and demand other information. And it's something that when someone says to you, we want to spend the same amount of money as we've put ourselves in debt since Confederation.
Exactly.
I don't know that anybody's elected and can turn around and lackadaisically say, well, we're elected, we can do what we want. I think that this is one real example. Yes.
Sorry,
yep.
I just wanted to put this out there so that during the election, correct me if I'm wrong, but during the election they pegged the cost of Muskrat Falls at $6.2 billion, right? Do I have that?
Mm-hmm.
Basically what it was, right? Well,
yeah, I think it was
then okay, so
yep.
they come out now. But they come out now with DG3 numbers that peg it at say 8 or whatever it's going to be. Then it's not really the same mandate, is it? Because it's a different cost to the project. So
well, not only that, Brad, but they've changed where the power is going, what it's being used for, what the purpose of it is. Started with domestic supply, went to export, gone to mining and needed industrially. I mean, it's all over the place. And so we can't say that we have a consistent project since the election. But when, I'd say this to you, Brad, when the government has failed to satisfy people, has failed to satisfy, many people obviously speaking publicly with very sincere, genuine, and real questions about this deal. And, as opposed to brushing them off, this is a process to say, you know what, here's the deal we've reached. We're going to try to sell it to you now because they certainly haven't sold it en masse yet. And so there's so many things that have changed since the election, Brad, that no, I can't say is under the same mandate here. And further to that, no government, and this government included, was elected for the sole purpose of developing Muskrat Falls. They were elected in a general election. This is something very, very specific and has 50-year connotations. So, a referendum seems to be, perfect.
I think that where the government got into trouble with this, going back to my charter challenge, where the government got into trouble with this is that they went along with and agreed to a referendum with the Innu and to try and push the process forward because they needed something on paper. Even though, bear in mind that what the New Dawn Agreement is not a legally binding agreement. It's only an agreement in principle from where they're working from. It's not a contract. The Innu Nation at any point in time could go back on any one of the 3 documents in that agreement and the whole thing is dead. So it's not a done deal yet with the Indians, but beyond that, they pushed, they recognized their right to have a referendum on something that was not even a legally binding issue, but focused on, by their own words, on the Muskrat Falls deal and Gull Island deal going ahead. Now, they have to give that same right to every other citizen. Legally, they're going to have a hard time explaining why they had to recognize a non-binding referendum on a non-binding legal document, but they won't give the same referendum to the rest of the people. So 2,200 people, God love them, 2,200 people got a referendum on Muskrat Falls, and 499,000 people didn't. There's something inherently wrong with that. And that will be the drive. The government's got one more week to get back to me, and I'm assuming that they're not going to change their mind. At which time there will be, in the middle of November, there will be papers served in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador. There will be a statement of claim regarding this, and there will also be an interlocutory order requesting that the court. The court cannot cause an injunction because it's the government. They can't put an injunction against the Queen, but they can do what they have, declaratory rights. In other words, they can declare that the charter rights were violated, and then the government has to act unless they're planning on using the notwithstanding clause. And I don't think in this case that the notwithstanding clause would actually pertain to it or not. So this is sort of the battle that we're taking to them, because it's that crucial to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's that crucial to the future, and it really is. It's not just a drama thing. We don't have any reason to be opposed to this agreement other than the obvious. We're not in the employ of anyone. We don't have any mines going on. We don't, whatever. This is, a bunch of grassroots people, not unlike yourself, Sue, who have tried to point out, try to bring, give people a perspective. Say, look, you're hearing this from the government. You're hearing that from the government. But here's what you're not hearing, and why aren't you hearing it? It's like I said, Mr. Williams, and he's doing his speeches, but he's not declaring his own self-interest in Alderaan. Well, I ask him, why aren't you? Why not? If you're not ashamed of it, if you're not embarrassed by it, if you don't think it's going to change people's minds on it, why not say it? But he's not.
Well, I'm kind of I'm a technical kind of gal, and I can read what the governance is of Alderaan, and therefore I know what's expected from the directors. And I don't need anybody to tell me, and I'm hoping that everyone takes the time and goes up and has a look themselves. Nobody needs to be advised by anyone. It's pretty straightforward when it comes to the governance of a corporation. And so, we don't really need to guess even. And then the question becomes is, who's responsible for protecting the best interests of the people, who is mandated to protect the best interests of the people, who's mandated to deal with the social issues and the socioeconomic issues and employment issues, and these are something that and I'll put this in the nicest kind of way, governments force companies to do because they're not going to do it willingly. They're going to take the best profit they can take. And in the same way that then opposition leader Danny Williams demanded that this come from a Voisey's Bay non-renewable limited ore body, and the Tories that came behind him, and then Premier, and now the party that's still in power from that time is appearing to abandon all of that and not demanding the same of themselves, when if we want to talk about a mandate that someone's been elected on, that's the mandate that they were elected on. So that was their fundamental problem, it was their fundamental beef, and that's what they got elected on. So, the referendum process is there for a reason. We're in a democracy. We have those tools if the government is willing to use them and the people want them. I think we're hearing from the people that they want it. They want this information. They want this process. And, I, for one, do not like the arrogance of someone acting as if they're spending the money out of their own bank account. I mean, this is the bank account of the people of the province. And so, we're a little more than bystanders. We're a little more than we'll give you some information when and if we want. And we have processes to deal with that. So, I think it's incumbent, Brad, on all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to take this whole process very seriously, to take this proposed project very seriously, and to consider what is in the best interest of my family, my children, my community, my province, what's going to allow young people to live here 15, 20 years from now when we will be hitting probably the worst of the demographic. And, people will no longer be able to afford to live here. So, these are the things that have to happen. But Brad, any final thoughts, anything that you want to say to the people out there? And I'm just going to be quiet and let you go on and say what it is you want to say about this whole process and project.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to, like you said earlier, Sue, I'd like to encourage people, look, if you get a moment, go to standinyourplacenl.com and sign the petition that's there. I mean, it's a way to express your feelings about the Muskrat Falls deal. It's a way to sort of send a message to the people who are driving this deal, whether it be the business community, Danny Williams, whoever else, the government. Send them a message that, look, we're happy for you. You're going to get your mines and everything else, but we want the people to agree. We want the people to have a say, and we want the people. If the people are going to say, look, we're going to be subsidizing your mine, then we want to agree to it. Because if we don't want to agree to subsidizing your mine shouldn't happen until your people are prepared to either get it from Hydro-Quebec or wherever's cheapest for you, or B, leave us out of it because we can't afford your kind of development. And I think that would be helpful. If people would go to standinyourplacenl.com. That would really help get the message out. I would really appreciate it if people would do that. I think that take some time to reflect on why this project is being pushed forward, the speed it's being pushed forward, and think about what you didn't hear in the beginning of the conversation about the mines, and then what you're hearing now from the government about the mines, and just come to the realization that, unfortunately, really unfortunately, that we're being used in that sense. And I think that's outrageous. I think there's a lot of people who are on fixed incomes, elderly, working poor. A lot of families are working poor, and people like that. I would say that's a majority in Newfoundland, Labrador, to be honest, are going to be absolutely sacrificed in that process. And I think people need to really wrap their minds around that and make their voices heard as strongly as possible.
And I know you like the politics of the province as well.
I don't know.
There's 2 minutes. Well, 2 minutes left of the program, but what do you expect, or what should we expect? What should we be looking for now from our opposition MHAs? What should we demand of them now? Because clearly the vote in the House is at this point a farce. But what should we expect?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think the opposition really needs to step its game up because, frankly, a lot of us, yourself, myself, and a lot of people out there have been fighting this and bringing these arguments up and putting them into the culture in general. That should have been done by the official opposition, as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't be left up to people like us. So they need to step their game up, as far as I'm concerned. Secondly, I think that when they go into these negotiations, they have the government. The government cannot go into this final debate without their approval for structuring the debate. It needs to be unanimous. So I think that they need to say, listen, whatever we decide here, we want to go to referendum of the people to ratify it, just like what happened with the New Dawn Agreement. That's the right thing to do. But I haven't heard a word of that come out. And, they're in a position of strength to do something about it and to stand their ground, stand in their place, if you will. They're in a position to do something about it, so do it.
Well, Brad, we're just cluing up, obviously. There's about 40 seconds left, and
sure.
I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I think we had a great conversation back and forth. I hope people take some of this and compare it, I guess, to their own questions and their own concerns, and once again encourage them to go to that website standinyourplacenl.com, and look at signing off that petition for a referendum and pub review. So once again, Brad, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for the great conversation.
Thanks for the time to put it out there, and it was my pleasure and my honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Take care.
Good night. And that ends our show, and we'll see you again next week.